Standby theme. Go on theme. Try that again. Cue it back. Standby theme. Go on theme. It's Tuesday, January 14th, 2014, and you're listening to SYN Boldly, the podcast, the Sign Your Name Project. I'm your host, Trey Comstock. With me this week is only Kathleen Royston.
Just me.
Because Stephen is somewhat ill. Get well soon, Stephen. On tonight's episode, we will be talking about two different perspectives on the inclusion debate. One about a moratorium of trials, and one about schism, as well as a broader discussion on what it means to be blessed and how we see God's blessing in this world. But we start tonight with a rundown on moratorium in the news. So one of the things that's been floating around in the air since the conclusion of the Schaeffer trial is this idea of, and this is kind of floated around before that, but has become really prominent after that trial, is this idea on ending trials, ending clergy trials over LGBTQ weddings. Not rather than changing the discipline, just saying, hey, we're going to stop doing trials about this, so just let it go. And though that stance has its advocates, including Reverend Dean Snyder of Foundry United Methodist in Washington, D.C., Bishop John Skoll of the New Jersey Episcopal area, Bishop Peggy Johnson of the Eastern Pennsylvania Annual Conference, who is the bishop that, who not presided over, but is in charge of the annual conference where Frank Schaeffer was removed from. And also Dr. Frank Thomas, Thomas Frank, who we talk about with somewhat hushed tones because he literally wrote the book on polity. He also is advocating an end to trials. Since the discipline has not been able to be changed, trials seem to have a whole bit of negative spectacle, does not paint the denomination in a very good light. And also, Thomas Frank's perspective is a very strange way to talk about covenant and community, to bring in the legal words of trial and jury and judge and prosecution and defense. And that the discipline doesn't actually define real well how these trials are supposed to go. And so we sort of lean on those in the legal profession to bring in ideas from outside the church to actually manage how these trials function. On the other side of this debate are radically different people. So we have good news, very good news.
Good news. Jesus loves everybody. Okay.
Good news argues that we still need to have these trials because that's how we can hold people accountable to what the discipline says, and that there needs to be a function of, and they use the phrase ultimately, and they use this word ultimate accountability, and I think that's to God and not to the Methodist Church, but whatever. They have this idea that there needs to be accountability, and that's why there needs to be trials. More recently, this week, is also an organization called, I believe, let me make sure I get this right, Love Prevails. Yes, thank you. Love Prevails. And Love Prevails is a kind of direct action advocacy group, of United Methodist who are trying to actively change United Methodist position on inclusion issues, particularly around marriage equality. And they recently interrupted a meeting of the connectional table to protest the lack of inclusion. And what they say is that trials need to continue. They actually want more trials, because what trials do is it brings the issue up and it starts to force some sort of change and draws attention to it and makes it a bigger deal and raises the stakes and makes it such that, we'll want change because we keep seeing this issue and we keep seeing the impact of this issue. And to get rid of trials would be to bury this under the rug and say, well, the discipline doesn't really need to change because no one's really getting prosecuted for it anymore. Whereas the discipline, in their view, is inherently incorrect and needs to be changed. And the only way to change that is by forcing the issue with these trials. So it's kind of people, at least I personally agree with and respect, on both sides of this debate. And so, Kathleen, I want to know, what's your thought on this idea of a moratorium on trials?
My first thought was, okay, that's awesome for marriage, but what about ordination of gay clergy? And I think that there's something really powerful that happens when there are trials, and there's this much bad PR around issues of human sexuality that does, in some ways, force the issue a little bit more. And while it is obviously incredibly disruptive, clergy who are openly performing gay weddings, I think in some ways I don't want to say be okay with, but are expecting this kind of action. And that to have those cease, I actually agree with those who say that to declare a moratorium on trials for this sweeps things under the rug. I think there's something really powerful about this kind of dark secret being brought out into the open. The United Methodist Church does have a very polarized understanding of love, that there's, in the discipline, there's a language about people who are gay being of sacred worth, and then also that they are incompatible with Christian teachings.
It's not that they are incompatible.
It's that the practice of homosexuality isn't. But there's extreme. Those are
they're
really
overlapping.
Hard to hold together.
They're overlapping concepts.
You are of sacred worth, but people who are gay are not going to say that I practice homosexuality necessarily. Anyway, that's a whole other can of worms. But I think that sweeping it under the rug is dangerous because it kind of it's like don't ask, don't tell. It is don't ask, don't tell.
It is quite literally don't ask, don't tell.
And don't ask, don't tell did not mean in the military that spouses or partners got equal rights. It does not change the underlying injustice. And I think bringing it out into the open, as painful as that is, I think that the Methodist way of avoiding conflict is problematic.
Well, I think for me, it's similar to what you're saying, that for civil disobedience to have any power, there needs to be attention pulled to it. Now, you can debate what is the intention behind a Methodist clergy performing a gay marriage. I think for Reverend Schaefer, it did not seem to be an act of civil disobedience. He informed his DS about it because he felt like he needed to, but he did not make a big issue of this until long after it happened. And it wasn't him that raised the issue to such a public way in the first place.
But I think in the trial it became an act of civil disobedience, and that was an interesting transformation.
I mean, it definitely certainly became that, and that's one of the reasons why I think in the end he handed in his credentials, because he realized the power of the action that he had done, not necessarily meaning that to be a hugely powerful in his relationship with his son, but not necessarily powerful on a denominational level.
Well, as like an ecclesial act of civil disobedience. Right. He wasn't like, I'm going to marry this person because, forget you, United Methodist Church. That was not.
Right. And I think...
arguably, that's not what any pastors who marry gay couples are doing.
Well, I'm not sure I know. I'm not sure that's true. I think for some, there's a balance. There's a balance between honoring loving these people, and also, since it is illegal or against the discipline, it is against the discipline for us to do so, there is an act of civil disobedience to it. And if you are going into this understanding it partly as an act of civil disobedience, a moratorium on trials takes some of the power out of that civil disobedience. Mm-hmm. At the same time, these trials, I tell you, they don't make us look so good. In terms of public perception of the United Methodist Church. And I understand that that's not the be-all and end-all, but I also think if we're talking about being able to pastor to people, it's difficult to do, but then you have to set aside the baggage of your church's bad PR.
And this is the sort of not conflict avoiding part of me. I think that, and I've had this conversation with United Methodist lay people on several different occasions, is I think church leadership does sweep a lot of this kind of stuff, at least like what happens at General Conference. So what happened at General Conference 2012 being so awful, unless you are a super nerdy Methodist layperson who hangs out with clergy, you don't know what happened.
Right.
And so I think it's a balance. Obviously, you don't want to stand up in the pulpit and be like, the United Methodist Church is terrible. But I think that bringing laity into this conversation and keeping laity in the loop is actually really, really important. And I think that so much of it has sort of been shut up behind closed doors of, with the polity nerds and the pastors, and that lay people maybe don't know what's going on. And I think when something like this happens, something as jarring as the Schaefer trial comes out in the New York Times, it forces the issue a little bit more. And I think politically that's important too, because who gets elected to be delegates at General Conference? Laity.
For them, there's a
not
close
only,
but there's a large laity
contingent. And so
contingent.
what's historically happened at General Conference is the laity have not necessarily reflected the diverse spectrum of opinions within United Methodist congregations. So I think when you have bad PR, you have people in those Sunday school classes who never would have thought about becoming a delegate being like, oh, wait, I can do something about this. And so that is not to say, and I struggle with this, is how do you talk nicely about a church that's being frustrating, that you also love? I mean, It's not just, we wouldn't be here if we didn't believe in the United Methodist Church. But I do think that dragging out the dirty laundry into public may be exactly what this church needs to some extent. And I think, and that comes, that's, not only is it a polity issue for me, that's also a theological issue. I think we've spent far too much time in the American church being like, everything is hunky-dory and we have Jesus and everything is fine. And I think that there's something powerful in brokenness and messiness being in public, and also confession about that.
I just wish we had another way to do it. I think
I agree.
Frank Thomas's argument lands with me. Good Lord, I keep doing that. Frank Thomas.
He has two first names. It's fine.
Well, and also Frank Thomas is a baseball player.
I didn't know that.
Thomas Frank's argument about it being a trial specifically is troubling theologically. It makes me feel like this is the Inquisition, which also held church trials.
Yep.
Church trials don't have real good history.
Here we go.
So, to me, I wish there was another mechanism. But, given that we have not found another mechanism, I also side, this is a slightly boring podcast listening, I suppose, but I also side that with love prevails. That there does need to be these trials, partly because to end trials, okay, fine, but if you end trials and the discipline never changes because we don't really feel the need to do it, we're still declaring that, that people of sacred worth are also living a lifestyle that is incompatible with the teachings of Christ. I also recently read Reporter the sentence, the choir director who happened to be gay, which is always a red flag. They happened to be gay. It was on an accident.
Oh my gosh, my favorite George Carlin sketch.
But I think it does kind of de-escalate the issue of making sure that our statement clearly reflects what is of God.
I think, and I also said this earlier, but it also doesn't, not having trials for marrying gay couples for clergy does not fix the problem of
ordination.
Yeah. And that's a big one.
Because you can't solve ordination without gay marriage. I mean, this is the fundamental thing that I've learned in the past 18 months is you cannot solve ordination without first solving marriage equality. Mm-hmm. Because in order for there to be LGBTQ clergy, they have to be able to be practicing homosexuals and have that be okay.
Or professionals, as the case may be.
Yeah, it's a ranking system. The
Russian judge is very tough.
It's very tough, Then the Ukraine, the
gosh,
little bribery,
it's
but
messy,
it's strange.
messy,
But anyways, or even the semi-pro, but it's rough. But you need to be able to kind of live your full life as a person of sacred worth, and not have to deny that part of you that feels attracted to people and feels called to marry another person of the same gender or of whatever gender you happen. The same gender almost implies a gender duality that isn't necessarily the case. Anyways, and you have to solve that before you can solve the ordination issue. And so even if we start prosecuting over marrying, there's still going to be that issue of ordination. And it still just becomes don't ask, don't tell. And that's a sidestep. That's a dodge. That's sort of progress in that we're doing less violence, but now we're just saying the laws don't matter.
It's don't ask, don't tell. I mean, right. it is, and that was repealed
for a reason.
That reason, right? So
speaking of all of this, there was an article you read recently about schism.
I did. So I think it was a few weeks ago, a professor from Claremont posted something on the United Methodist Reporter, basically that breaking up is hard to do, but it's the only way for the United Methodist Church to do what it needs to do. Which, it was a really interesting article. I read it when it was published. Oh, it was more than a few weeks ago. Oh, gosh.
It was a while back.
Wow. Okay, it must have made the rounds again recently. The date on it is October 19th, 2012, but I read it more recently than that. So this article was published, and in one of the comments, someone said, essentially, someone who is a local pastor, said, essentially, breaking up doesn't solve the fact that gay children are going to be born into conservative Methodist churches. Mm-hmm. Which is a really interesting, and interestingly enough, I heard this from someone at Reconciling Ministries Network, which was, we will continue to fight as long as there are gay kids being born, which I thought was a really interesting way to think about this. So anyway, all of that is to say that Jeremy Smith, who writes Hacking Christianity, which is a really great blog if you have not checked it out. I always find his stuff incredibly thought-provoking. And I won't go off on the bunny trail. But anyway, so he talked about this comment from this article, mm-hmm. and wrote a blog post that basically said the same thing, which was, as long as, if the United Methodist Church splits, what's going to happen is the conservative side is going to become increasingly conservative, and they thank you, Kat. And as they become increasingly conservative and insular, children who are born into families who are in those Methodist churches who are gay are going to struggle because there's going to be no one there who is a safe place. And the other thing I thought that was interesting in this is he talks about how, as a world church, we do share responsibility not only for the ridiculously high suicide rate among gay teenagers, but also for people who are gay in other countries.
Sure.
And it was a really very thought-provoking article, and he argues against schism, because he says if we just split, we are failing in our mission to love everybody. And what does it mean if you are a gay child in a family that is incredibly conservative, but hey, look, your pastor is really progressive and you have someone to go to? And he frames it for progressives as this is a mission, that what we do as progressives in an increasingly not so progressive denomination is a mission effort, which is very interesting. It was thought-provoking, and he says, basically, what he says at the end is, I understand why individuals choose to leave the denomination, but splitting is not going to fix this conversation. And I have my own thoughts on it. We talked a little bit more about it, but Trey, I would love to know what you think about this argument. What would this look like?
I think it sets up kind of a strange duality, because say the split does occur, and we form what will probably be the Methodist Church and the Reconciling Methodist Church, or whatever that is.
That's what Trey has named it.
Yeah, I've named, despite the fact that I'm not actually pro-schism, I have named it the Reconciling Methodist Church. But if the Reconciling Methodist Church is doing its job, then I don't necessarily think his argument holds up. Because if the Reconciling Methodist Church can speak into those situations, because no one lives in a vacuum. This is the 21st century, and whether we're talking about the United States or Uganda, which are the two places he talks out of, Oklahoma and Uganda, they both have the internet, and they both have access to information that says something different. And so maybe it can be missional within the broader United Methodist context, but that starts to become difficult when being missional also means, to a certain extent, setting aside what you believe. And that's to me where it becomes troubling, where, I do international missions, and so I spend time thinking about what it is to be missional, and, I have issues when, as a missionary, I have to pay a bribe. And to me, this almost seems like that same kind of thing, where in order to be missional, do I have to then compromise and appear to stand for something I don't? Or can the Reconciling Methodist Church have a missional presence into these situations where people feel hopeless in other churches, not just the United Methodist Church as currently formed?
I think, and we talked a little bit about this before the show, but I grew up in a very conservative, insular denomination, and I'm not that old, and I had the internet, and I didn't even know that you could vote Democrat and be a Christian. I didn't know that you could be progressive and be a Christian. Like, it's a ridiculous thing to say, but I was in my 20s before I realized that that caring for the poor was important to Christians, or that you could not be a biblical literalist and be a Christian, or that you could be gay and be a Christian. And I think that that's the part of his argument that I really do understand, because the more conservative and insular denominations get, the less contact people have with the outside world. And even if you have intellectual contact, you may not have theological contact.
I think that might somewhat underestimate people's ability to care regardless of what they believe. I'll tell a story that's not directly related to homosexuality, but I think illustrates this. A professor of mine, John Blevins, tells this story of a woman in his very southern, very conservative community. A young woman got pregnant long before she was married, and it would have ruined her college career if she would have had the child, partly because of the rules of her university and partly because raising a child is just a difficult thing. And so a pro-life Southern Baptist conservative woman drove this girl across 3 states to procure an abortion.
Yep.
Despite the fact that she didn't believe in that, despite the fact that everything she knew was against that. In the end, from her perspective, and this is not a pro-abortion rant. What this is an illustration of that sometimes care, no matter what you believe on the surface, can supersede what the theology of any denomination, no matter how insular, is.
I think the problem with that is I do agree with you. I think that those of us who have come from conservative denominations and found ourselves in ones that are less so, can speak to this, that, as soon as you know someone who is gay, you are less likely to be homophobic. I mean, that's how it works. I think, and this article talks a lot, and we've talked on the show about the suicide rate among LGBTQ teenagers. And I think the problem is not the caring after that happens. I think it's the fact that what does it mean when your theology and theological understanding and scriptural understanding lead people to believe that they are worthless. So I think it's not the care, it's the aftermath.
But then I think, however this falls out, whether there's a schism or no, those of us who see sacred worth as defined more broadly to include the ending the idea of homosexuality as a sin, need to do our mission's piece, whether we are in the same denomination or a different denomination. I don't see how schism necessarily affects this either way. Because there are already Methodist churches that are that insular. United Methodist churches that are that insular. And see it exactly as you talk about your home church growing up seeing it.
Although, one of the interesting things, at least in the churches that have ordained elders, is there's itineracy. And so it is entirely possible at some point in the next 40 years I will be the pastor of a church that is very different from me.
Like I am
you
now.
Are, right. And I think that that's one of the strengths of the Methodist system. And so I think when you have that level of diversity, it's not elders cannot self-select in the same way. I mean, you sign up to go where you are sent.
But also, yes, theoretically. But also, often bishops are conflict avoiding.
Right. Is this just like a Methodist thing? Is it just like Methodist conflict avoiding? Come on, people, bring it out into the open.
Well, I don't know. It does certainly not come from John Wesley. John Wesley never backed down from any conflict
he did not.
ever.
Just ask Sophie Hopkins.
And neither did Asbury. So, like, our two kind of, like, founding figures, neither of which were, wilting lilies in the conflict department.
Right.
They stuck it to whoever needed sticking to it.
Yeah, Bunny Trail, and then I think some of that stems from the fact that we are a large denomination and we like being a large denomination.
Sure. I mean,
and I think that the conflict avoidance comes from that, is we take great joy in being like, well, those crazy Episcopalians broke up with the world church, but we didn't.
Right. Yes, I think we actually do that exact thing.
P.S. Crazy Episcopalians, can you please tell us how to do it? Because that would be great.
You leave. I mean, step one,
but
build a new building. Here's
how
it goes. Step one, build a new building.
Well,
step two, move into that building.
No, but I think what the Episcopalians did, and I'm not an expert, so Episcopals, sorry, you can, throw incense at me, is there's just swing that around, just swing it around, that there is still there's the Anglican communion, so there is still dialogue and fellowship between the churches. Unity in Christ does not mean homogeneity.
Right. But I think we would still be part of the broader Wesleyan, because there is also still, like, world Methodism that the RMC would also be a part of.
Right.
And I think it would be, to me, and this is just me, okay? Thinking it through from my perspective. Please, someone write in and give me another perspective, because I can only talk out of my own. But from my own perspective, I would think, I am not a gay man.
It seems to me.
I am not a gay man, but I am a man that is often plugged into other marginalized categories. And often for me, it is people who are finally able to speak prophetically on what it is to be a person living in these marginalized categories that speaks to me more than hushed voices in back rooms saying, oh no, you're actually okay. Yeah. So to me, the RMC would be a chance where we could finally say from the rooftops, and it's somewhat we're trying to do the show, but what everyone who believes this can finally say from the rooftops, no, this is not a sin. This needs to stop. Yeah. And so that kid in Oklahoma can see that. And that person in Uganda can see that. And there can be, this is a terrible analogy, but that city on a hill effect. To me, that would be more missional. Possibly. Actually, the most missional thing would be changing the stupid stance in the stupid church, which is what I'm still trying to do. Okay? To me, that's...
Way to mince words there, Trey Comstock.
Okay? So what I'm actually
Tell
trying
us what
to
you really think.
Changing the stupid stance in the stupid church.
Stupid.
But if that proves just impossible, or not the will of God, or whatever, then the RMC to me is actually the next step, rather than staying as a big tent just running from conflict.
Talking about our own experience, I just feel like I remember when I was a kid and the ELCA decided to be in full communion with the Episcopal Church. Mm-hmm. And the ELCA, for those of you who are not Lutherans, is the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. And it is the far more progressive of, and the largest, I might add, of the Lutheran denominations. And they ordain women and all kinds of stuff, all kinds of crazy, awesome things. And somebody and I remember this vividly, I was like 9. Somebody put this article from the newspaper about the Episcopalians and the ELCA getting together on the church bulletin board. And I remember someone in the congregation saying to my family something to the effect of, well, I mean, the Episcopalians aren't even really Christian. I can't believe the ELCA is doing this. And so I think the danger with the split is people in conservative, super conservative churches looking and saying, "Oh, those are just the crazy, heathen, godless liberals."
And it's hard it's hard to look at them as within
and
as
right
part of
within
us.
Within and there's an erosion of authority too, and that's just something to think about. So I do think there is the city on the hill, but there's also the crazy people who live in the commune and have a drum circle and eat nothing but granola on a hill. Crazy. I'm just thinking about, like, my childhood is coming back. My
She's regressing.
I am a little bit. My family calling people who voted Democrat crazy liberal wackos. Well,
you're a wacko.
I am a crazy liberal wacko. But that's just something to think about too, is increasing polarization. Like, what if schism being polarization? And I have kind of a weird, because I grew up with this in the Lutheran church. The Lutherans because talk about someone who could not back down from a fight. Martin Luther. And you add stubborn Germans and Scandinavians into the mix, and nobody's gonna get along.
And beer at church events.
So that too. So I grew up with this. So the Lutheran Church has never been anything that resembles united ever.
Sure.
And so there's this huge polarization between the 3 Lutheran denominations. So the ELCA is mainline Protestant, and then on the far right you have the Wisconsin Synod that, like, even the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, which is very conservative, thinks is crazy conservative. Ooh. So you have this polarization. So I do in some ways worry about that. And I'm not sure that people in the Wisconsin Synod even consider people in the ELCA to be Lutheran. So what does it mean if we become so polarized that we are no longer, there's not really a Wesleyan umbrella. There may be a historical affinity, but there's not any real theological or personal connection. It's just something to think about.
I think I've made this clear that in reality, what I'm in favor of is Big Tent Methodism, but only if Big Tent Methodism has the possibility of reform. And right now, as we've talked about several times, I still see hope. I still see as there's hope for Big Tent Methodism and reform within it. Because I think in the end, we are all better off hanging together than we are hanging separately. It's a joke on a Ben Franklin quote, but I think in the end, we are better off together. But it is becoming increasingly difficult to both stay together and be who I feel called to be.
Yeah.
And at some point, we all, if it does reach just a point where this is clearly not going to get through and we lose that hope, what do? And how do we still be missional even when that hope is gone? And I think that's where schism, if done the right way, begins to look attractive, but ideally that's not what I want. I would much rather Big Tent Methodism and show that love can prevail even in the midst of fierce opposition. And so with that, we transition on to our discussion. So, in a lot of our discussions on privilege and on inclusion and poverty and women in the church, we often come back to this idea of what does it truly mean to be blessed. You have many that look at large churches and powerful people and you go, wow, they must be blessed by God. If God is with us, no one can be against us. And clearly large and big and rich and wealthy means blessing. And then we have other kind of more subversive things like the Gospels that often talk about blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek. And so they're still not rich. There still is poor. There still are poor people. There still is poverty. And so what does it mean that people are blessed? And how do we talk about blessing as well as this idea of financial blessing or power and power structures? And so, Kathleen, I know you're the one who suggested this topic. So what are your thoughts on this idea of blessing?
I have so many thoughts on this topic. We got to this through a discussion of missions and mission trips, particularly.
Yep.
When people go to places in the developing world, people from churches go to places in the developing world and come back and say things like, well, going and seeing how they were living just made me realize how blessed I was.
As if they are not, as if those people who are living, for those of you on the audio version, I'm doing air quotes, living like that, are not also blessed children of God.
And this is something that I've heard in sermons. I've heard lots of places. People put "too blessed to be stressed" stickers on their cars, and then I want to key them in the most loving and Christ-like way possible. And the notion of blessing, and what does blessing look like? And this is something scripturally that I've struggled with quite a bit. So in the Old Testament, you have things that say, like, God's going to give you a bunch of stuff. Good job, chosen people. Woo! Here's a land. Never mind the people already in it. And you're going to have all this stuff. And then you have things that push back against that. You have, I don't know, maybe the entire book of Job.
Yep. Or a lot, and certainly the New Testament interpretation of Old Testament text of what it means to be given, what it means to be blessed. And
gosh, you had to take it to the New Testament. I wasn't done talking about the Old Testament.
I think as Christians,
Stop
we cannot
jumping to Jesus.
As Christians, we cannot separate the testaments, but view them as one witness to the same idea.
Okay, so I'm still in the Old Testament because it's awesome.
That's also where you're always.
I'm always. It's because I grew up with the chosen people, and I'm very attached to the Old Testament. Anyway, and then you have within the canon, you have this sort of unfolding understanding of blessing. So in Torah, you have blessing equals stuff and promised land, and then exile and all kinds of messy things happen, and you see in the text people struggling with what does it mean to be chosen and blessed and still have all of this crap happening to you. And this is one of the reasons, soapbox, walking up my soapbox ladder, because I'm short and I need a ladder to get up my soapbox, is why reading all of the Old Testament is important, because you see these kind of things unfolding and changing and moving and blah, blah. I love it. Anyway, so how do we talk about blessing in the church? What is our understanding of blessing? Is blessing stuff? Does God bless some people more than God blesses others?
Yes.
What does that look like? So I just, it's an open-ended question that I am struggling with as well, because I find it kind of icky. I really, obviously, if you've been listening to the show for any amount of time, the prosperity gospel, if you
financial blessings, if you pray hard enough,
Jesus is gonna buy you a pony and a jet. I find that really reprehensible.
And a jet on a pony.
Does that make it a Pegasus?
Yes.
So it's a conversation worth having. Is what is blessing? What does blessing look like? Who's blessed? Who's not? Is everybody blessed? So,
I mean, for me, I approach it a lot of this from the liberation theology perspective, that there is a preferential option for the poor, and then that actually means that the poor are more blessed than I am. That is what that means, is that there is this preferential option, and thus the real theology of Christ is happening on the margins, quite deliberately, and it is to be pulling those at the center to look towards the margins. And that is part of that process of blessing. And in participating in that process, I may also be blessed, but that is not the goal, and that is not the point, and that is not what this is speaking into. And so to me, that disassociates blessing from power. That, for me, what I see a lot, especially in the prosperity gospel and in that implicit prosperity gospel of large churches, is that the more blessed. Because the more power, the more money, the more buildings,
Stuff.
the bigger God box, the what, to quote Clarence Jordan, the whatever. The bigger the whatever, the more powerful. Oh, that person's very powerful. They must be very blessed. No, that is not. They have accrued power. And I think part of the subversive aspect of the gospel, because I often, as Kathleen approaches things from the aspect of the chosen people, I read a lot of Matthew and Luke. And
Which are, I might say publicly, the two best gospels. Not that I'm supposed to have favorites, but
it's
I
certainly
do.
If I have to pick favorites, it's certainly Luke. But I look to Christ in there talking about not subverting the power structure. And blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor, blessed are the peacemakers. And in that is saying that when you look at big and powerful, that is not a showing of God's blessing. That is often showing a misappropriation of the gifts of God.
And it's that way that God, at least particularly in the Gospels, but I think also in the Old Testament, the witness that we have is a God who is continually unexpected and turning things upside down all the time. So you have, in the Old Testament, you have younger sons being the important ones, and you have, oh, look, Jesus, like, come on, and the Beatitudes, and you have all of those, this inversion of human power. And I think one of the things, particularly in our modern culture, but presumably in ancient ones too, is stuff equals power.
Right.
Stuff equals our own security. Stuff equals us building walls around ourselves and, piles of our stuff so we feel safe. And I think you see over and over again in Scripture a witness to a God who turns all of that upside down.
But also a God that is interested in everyone being safe.
Absolutely.
And I think... And then, so that, to me, that's the liberation theology aspect of this, is that, sure, yes, I think God wants all of us to end up safe. Mm-hmm. But I think that involves some of us being unsafe in order that all may be, being less safe so that all may be safe. And that gifts do not equal blessings. Gifts equal a responsibility to be part of this process.
And I think you see that even very, very early in the canon when God tells Abraham, like, look, I'm going to give you all this stuff and all these descendants, like, I will bless you and you will be a blessing to other people. That there is responsibility that comes with our things. But I think even scripturally it's complicated. I think that there are places in Scripture where blessing equals stuff.
Sure.
There just are.
Absolutely, sure. Absolutely.
And those are texts worth, particularly for those of us who heart liberation theology and are on the more progressive side of things, those are also texts worth wrestling with.
But they always, to me, they always need to be balanced against our responsibility, even in the prophets, to the stranger.
Absolutely.
And to the foreigner in your land, and to the widows. And there's very seldom is there in the gospel just blessing equals stuff, okay, you're good. It's often blessing equals stuff, here's what you do.
Yeah, and if you don't do... smiting well, not smiting, but
But there's always
from the Neo-Assyrians.
The prophets are often full of, even in good times. So say things are doing well. You go into some of the later prophets, the post-exilics. Things are looking better. But hey, you're not doing what you're supposed to do, and this is still a problem. You still, you look at like 3rd Isaiah or something like that, where it's like there's still a balance of, okay, blessing, yeah, wonderful, hallelujah, but hey, there's a responsibility that comes with that this blessing should be for all.
I also think, and I told this story, and I may have told this story on the show before, but there was a sermon that I heard that basically said to a well-off congregation, look at all that you have, you are so blessed. And I heard a snippet of this, and I was with a close friend, and she said, so does that mean that people who don't have all the stuff aren't blessed? And she told me a story that's really stuck with me, which was a pastor in Mississippi right after Hurricane Katrina. People were saying things like, we were so blessed that the hurricane didn't hit us. We were just so blessed. And this pastor got up and said, no, the hurricane hit us and we are blessed. And I think that really challenges the idea that blessing equals stuff. And I know what you're saying about we have things and we have a responsibility to use them. But I'm not convinced that that's what blessing is either.
Sure.
Even if it's in scripture in some places, I'm not sure about that. And so I think my other question is, what does blessing look like in marginalized communities?
I think that's where for me the blessing and stuff conundrum breaks down. Mm-hmm. So I try to spend a fair amount of my life in the developing world. It's something I feel a strong calling to, and I have seen American college students start crying when they saw the homes that the community in Kenya that I worked in, where they lived, right? Or they just, it must be so terrible. It must be so terrible. I'm so blessed to have what I have, and I'm not sure that understands blessing, because when I live in those communities, I see happy people. I see people with some struggles, but I look in the richest communities in this nation and I see people with problems, and then possibly different problems, but problems. And I see happy people living happy lives, worshiping God, giving thanks to God, and supporting each other. And so I think blessing as translated through Christian community and through the experience of God in the everyday is, to me, much more of what blessing is about. That blessing is about hope, and that blessing is about grace, and that blessing is about strength, and it's not about, I have an iPad and an air conditioner that works sometimes, and you have a kerosene lantern and a duct tape soccer ball.
Maybe some of the task here is to untangle blessing from gratitude. That sort of Thanksgiving gratitude that we do, which is like, thank you, God, for my house and my car. And, I think maybe even in some ways the way that we give thanks for our families. I have to wonder if there's a way, and I don't know the answer to this, if there's a way to untangle gratitude from the understanding of blessing. That blessing is God's presence with us in our lives.
However that manifests
itself. And it can call us to gratitude, but maybe they're separate. 'Cause I know when I take my first sip of tea in the morning, I am incredibly grateful. I'm like, good job, God, on tea.
Sure.
I mean, really, that's my first spiritual moment in the morning, is me taking my first sip of tea and going, oh, thank God, which is really what I do. But I'm not sure I would consider that to be the same thing as God's presence with me. Does that make sense?
But I think maybe not tea itself, but your ability to enjoy it is, I think, part of God with you.
But I also think, and so maybe that's however it manifests itself, right? So as long as I don't say like, oh, I'm so grateful that I am able to sit here and drink a cup of tea, unlike those people over there. I think maybe the problem comes when our understanding of blessing is always,
sounds a lot like capitalism,
is always dependent on the suffering of someone else.
Right.
Like if it's someone else not having what we have that makes us understand blessing. What we have, and that if we see that as blessing, I think that can be problematic.
I think this is an issue that will, as with all of these discussions, are not necessarily going to be resolved. But I think it is an interesting idea to separate being grateful to God for the many blessings that we've received and not using it as a chance to say, unlike those over there, we got to really pray for them. But you know what some of them are doing? They're really praying for us and our manifest structural sin and our, somewhat godless Western lifestyle. So I think they're praying for us in the same way that we're praying for them. We're just praying about different things. And so I think blessing is not finite, and blessing means different things to different people. And we should just be thankful for God's presence in our lives and recognize how that manifests and give thanks that wherever in the world you are, God is there too. And on that note, we should probably get off the air. Thank
Bye,
you,
Internet.
Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of SYN Boldly. As ever, if you have any feedback, synboldly@endfear.org is the email address. The Facebook is facebook.com/the Sign Your Name Project, and we are at SYN Boldly on Twitter. And go in peace to love and serve the Lord and end fear by signing your name. Good night. Pre-show, yes.
And during show, we need pre-show.
Okay, go ahead and take us off local record.
Goodbye, Internet.
Goodbye, Internet.